Shalom, my bitches. My end is here at NFY, bringing you the Kevin Jenkins Experience, Chapter 1, Part 2, by Hambone3110. Jenkins didn't seem especially frightened by the news, but then I realized he had almost certainly never heard of the only carnivorous species in the galaxy that preferred the meat of fellow sapiens. I didn't have time to explain. There was the sound of pulse gunfire and a squealing being galloped into the customs area before being caught from behind by a kinetic pulse that hurtled it to the ground, broken and dying. Jenkins sprinted for cover, and I followed. Despite my longer legs, he covered the ground faster and threw himself behind a customs booth as another kinetic pulse missed him. I turned and shot at the hunter that had aimed at us. My shot evaporated harmlessly against a protective field identical to mine. There were 3 more behind it, and I ducked into cover next to the human as their return fire threatened to overwhelm my defenses. "We're in trouble," I whined. All around us, fleeing and panicking immigrants were being smashed to the ground by hunter firepower. Jenkins popped his head above the countertop and ducked again as a volley of shots targeted him. "6 of them," he said. "Ugly motherfuckers." I had to agree, as I fired off a few suppressing shots around the corner. While judging any species by the aesthetic values of one's own species doesn't make a lot of sense, hunters were ugly. Their skin was ceramic white and wet, and 7 eyes, each blinking independently, provided them with exceptional depth perception. On 6 legs, they were extremely stable, and their forelimbs were cybernetically fused into their heavy pulse guns, making disarming them impossible. These ones were wearing full military combat harness. My own light security harness was no match. Our only hope was the magazine of nerve jam grenades, which I realized with a falling sensation of failure I had left in the locker. "The grenades," I swore. "Only hope?" Jenkins asked. He was holding himself low and hunched, and I could see those dense heavy gravity muscles tense and ready under his lightly furred skin. I nodded, fighting back the urge to excrete in my terror. If they took us alive, we would be food. By the time I realized that Jenkins had taken off at a flat sprint toward the locker, he was almost a third of the way there. I knew what I had to do. The hunters were turning to fire at him as I popped up from cover. They saw me coming, but I had put 3 rounds into one, and its shield failed against the third. It collapsed, what passed for its face shattered by the impact, and I ducked as its fellows returned fire. One ignored me and kept firing at Jenkins, but he was so fast, so small, that the round smacked into the deck plating around him. He threw his feet out ahead of him, and slid the last few strides to the locker. He popped up to his feet, looked at me as he raised his arm, and threw, accurately and much, much further than I could have thrown them. Then a pulse round took him in the torso and flung him against the wall. I had no time to mourn. I caught the grenades, slipped one from the cylindrical container, counted 2 light pulses from the indicator around its edge, and threw it towards the enemy on the third. A second later, there was a flare of light and shrieking, but it wasn't enough. 2 of the hunters rampaged past their convulsing comrades, rushing me. I fired, but fear took my aim, and the best I managed was a single round that impacted harmlessly against a shield before their return fire broke my own shielding and ruined my arm. I collapsed, shaking from the pain. The hunters trotted round the corner, chattering in their deep, guttural language that I couldn't understand. I stared at their twin heavy pulse guns, too afraid to even close my eyes before the end. It didn't come. Instead, something black, blue, and brown hurtled into the flank of one of the alien warriors with a crunch and a hiss of pain. It staggered, collided with its comrade, and fell. Jenkins, somehow impossibly alive despite taking a kinetic pulse round to the chest, wrestled very briefly with the hunter, and then there was a horrible, organic splitting noise. The hiss became a shriek, and the gun in his hands, blood and meat dripping from the cybernetic interface. The second hunter snap-fired, and Jenkins dropped the gun as the shot winged him. He didn't seem to notice. Instead, he pounded, and a second shot barely missed him before his forepaw lashed out, balled up into a hard knot of gravity-densed bone and flesh, which he drove into the hunter's eye cluster. It shrieked and flailed, swatting the human with its hind limbs. He didn't appear to care. Instead, he caught one of the flailing limbs, braced one of his own feet against the hunter's flank, and heaved with a roar. There was a grim tearing sound, and the hunter's leg came away. Its blood sprayed thick and fat through the air, coating the man from the death world, but he ignored it. He didn't spare the fallen alien a second glance as he charged at the lone survivor. It was suicide. The hunter had a clear shot, and took it. Then it took a second, then a third, and a fourth. And though every single shot was on target, Jenkins just kept going, apparently completely impervious to impacts that would have pulped any other species. Hunters didn't wear interspecies communications implants, but I didn't need one to recognize the fear and panic it briefly had time to show before it was beaten to death with another hunter's severed leg. Jenkins just kept hitting it again and again, snarling and shouting, ordering it to die, and declaring improbable things about its parentage, before finally he stopped and stepped away from the broken thing he had made, gulping down great shuddering breaths of what, to him, must have been very thin and dry air. Then he apparently lost the strength to stand, and his forelimbs folded up underneath him. He sank down until the bottom of his jaw was resting against his torso. I swallowed my pain and staggered to my feet. My arm dangled uselessly by my side, and every slight movement was agony. But I had to know if he was alive. The all-clear alarm sounded just before I reached him, and he moved in response to it. One of his eyes had swollen and was turning a dark red-purple. But the other blinked at me, and his mouth curled upwards at the corners. I saw that one of his teeth was missing. "Tough bastards," he said, and spat bright red blood onto the hunter corpse next to him. I couldn't help it. I had to laugh. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, go ahead and subscribe. If you want to hear more of my stuff, go ahead and like. I did that in the wrong order, but you know what? Do both of those things. And if you want to hear all of my stuff that will be coming out in the following however long I continue doing this for, hit the bell icon on the side. Side note, if you haven't seen Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse yet, do so. Have a nice one, y'alls.